This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. So, Gran Turismo the movie, not the game. I saw the movie last Friday, and I just thought I'd do a bit of a quick review, my first impressions, just sort of talking about, what I felt going into it, and of course my experience of actually watching the movie. So before we start, one thing I've got to get off my chest is that Gran Turismo is not a video game movie, despite the name. This is just something I want to point out, because I've seen from a few places, a few different people, saying with their reviews or their comments, oh, Gran Turismo, compared to other video game movies, etc., things like that, it's not a video game movie at all. Because the point is, a video game movie generally incorporates elements of the game into the story, like, the characters, the general themes, even the world, but not always. Obviously, Gran Turismo doesn't do that, because it can't really, there isn't enough in the games to actually build a movie from, so that's the point. It's not a video game movie, because Gran Turismo the game only features in the movie as a plot point, something to drive the story forwards, to get things started, get things moving. In general, it's a sports movie. So going into it, that's what you can expect. Not a movie about Gran Turismo, a movie that features Gran Turismo in parts, but is primarily just a sports movie. So the movie follows the story of Jann Mardenborough, a gamer who is very talented at Gran Turismo, who gets the chance to compete in GT Academy, a competition aiming to turn gamers into real-life racing drivers. And of course, as will be very obvious from the thumbnail of this video, and of course as from the marketing of the movie itself, it is based on a real-life story. It all happened. Well, mostly. So this review, I'm not going to do any spoilers, not going to have any spoilers, just because the movie has been delayed in a number of places. The global release is delayed due to the SAG-AFTRA strikes. But in the UK, and a lot of cinemas, they're still honouring the original release date, which is August the 9th, I believe, hence how I was able to see it and many other people. But yeah, as I say, I'm not going to go into any spoiler talk. There will be a couple of light spoilers, but I mean, to be honest, spoilers don't really matter in this movie. That's kind of my first point, is that honestly not a whole lot happens. It's all, more than 2 hours of runtime, and it honestly doesn't feel like that. It kind of feels like if you've seen the trailers to the movie, you've pretty much already seen the movie. You can kind of piece things together, you can work out what's going to happen. Even if you don't know the story of Jann Mardenborough of GT Academy, you can piece things together. It's not very complex in that sense. It's fairly by the numbers. I mean, it's an underdog story. You've got this underdog, you've got Jann overcoming adversity. He's treated as the outsider. He's got this, tough mentor character who gradually bonds with him over time. It is fairly, by the book. And another point is that in the movie, there's a couple of occasions where things just kind of happen. It's a case of like, now we're doing this. This is happening, which isn't really fully communicated as to why it's happening or how it can happen. And in some ways it's understandable because, if you look at the real life story, obviously the decisions aren't made by Jann a lot of the time. They're made by, Nissan or whoever is managing him. But from a movie perspective, it just kind of comes out of nowhere. I mean, the final, the ending, the climax of the movie does feel like that, where it just sort of kind of happens because it has to. So yeah, that's one thing really. But it is fairly realistic to the real life story, which, as I say, not great for a movie necessarily, and the general audience, but for authenticity, I think it's fairly solid, apart from a couple of things which obviously I'll talk about in a bit. And also, of course, the end of the movie, which basically the movie ends, it's the story's been wrapped up, it's reached its conclusion, and then they immediately have to show you, the real life story of Jann Mardenborough and how that compares to the events in the movie, which felt odd. I mean, I expected them to do it to some degree. I didn't expect them to do it in the way they did, where, the movie reaches its conclusion and immediately they have to show you, and compare it to the real life story. It really feel like or it really feels like they needed to prove it was real. This actually happened. It's very in your face about that. I mean, even the subtext, Gran Turismo based on a true story. And obviously that's kind of what my thumbnail alludes to, is that they really want to push it. And in some ways I do understand, because, a general audience, I can imagine a lot of them will not know that this is a real story. Just even from watching the full movie, they could think, it's all entirely fictional. But yeah, from my perspective, it's a little bit too in your face about it. It got a little bit annoying at times. Let's talk about the characters now. So for the most part, I felt they were pretty fine. So we had Archie Madekwe as Jann Mardenborough, who was solid. Could be a little bit grating at times, but I felt like his dynamic with David Harbour's character, Jack Salter, who was sort of the GT Academy mentor, or at least gradually grows into his mentor as time goes on. I felt that was a decent dynamic. It was fairly engaging, at least to me anyway. You had Orlando Bloom's character, who was Danny Moore, the Nissan executive who comes up with the GT Academy program. He was fairly fun. I mean, he was overacting at times, but to be honest, I prefer it than underacting. He at least made it enjoyable to watch in places, even if it was a bit over the top, particularly near the start. But still, I felt it was decent. In terms of character motivations, again, fairly by the book, sort of, this happens, you feel this sort of way, and then you see what the characters are trying to do, or what they want to do. So that was fairly simple. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that as a bad thing, but just an observation. But also at times there were a couple of situations where characters would just sort of bend to the needs of the plot. So there was one example near the end of the movie in particular, where a character who had featured previously in the movie just kind of, does a 360 entirely to their entire, I guess, dynamic with another character, and it felt very strange. I mean, you could sort of infer why based on the situation, but the movie doesn't really imply that, so it just came off as a bit odd and a bit like, we didn't really have enough time to really flesh that out. I mean, for example, with David Harbour's character, the mechanic who becomes the GT Academy mentor. I mean, he initially is completely against the idea, or not completely against it, but completely dismisses it. He doesn't care at all. And in the span of one scene, which lasts like a minute, he completely changes his mind. He gives up entirely what he's doing at the moment, being an engineer, and is just like, screw it, I'll give it a go. And it was a bit odd. I mean, to put it lightly. I mean, I understand why, because it obviously needed to happen, but it just felt like in a movie that lasted over 2 hours, they could have at least fleshed out a little bit more. Maybe, planted a little seed of doubt initially, and then, acted on that, and built into it, rather than it just happening in one scene. It was just a bit rushed, but yeah, I mean, not the most important thing in the grand scheme of things. I mean, the most egregious example of, things just kind of happening because they need to is with the love interest, which, I mean, I'm not joking, where it feels like the love interest only exists because someone at Sony Pictures gave, the director a checklist of things that need to be in the movie, and that was one of them. I mean, I know a lot of movies do this as well, where they have plot points that, are just kind of there because they need to appeal to a general audience, so that's just one of them. But it is so egregious in this movie, it's ridiculous. Like, you would literally remove all of the scenes where the love interest features, and nothing would change. It would change nothing about the main character, it would change nothing about the character motivations or the main story, or anything, really. And also, as far as I'm aware, it didn't actually happen in real life either. So they just kind of put it in there. Again, like I say, to meet a quota is what it feels like. And, if I was directing the movie, here's what I would do. I would get rid of all of those scenes, because, they're not relatable to sweaty gamers such as ourselves. And what I do is I'd replace it with a subplot where Jann is grinding GT7 to save up for a classic car in the Legends dealership, and then he buys it and realizes it's completely useless and he can't use it for anything. That would be a great source of character motivation. He could have a solid character arc, but they went with the love interest instead. So yeah, whatever. So what a lot of you thinking is, should I go see this movie? Is it actually worth watching? And I'm going to approach this from two perspectives. So the first one is from the perspective of a long-time Gran Turismo fan. And from that perspective, no, not really. In the sense of, you can still enjoy it, but being a fan of Gran Turismo, of the games, isn't going to make the movie better, or necessarily give you a stronger reason to watch it, other than purely just the name and the brand, and that's kind of it. So some elements of it are enjoyable. Obviously, it does feature the game in the movie. I mean, it's a bit anachronistic because when Jann was in GT Academy, it was, Gran Turismo 5 was the current game, but obviously for marketing reasons, they've got to use GT7, so some things are a bit, forced into place to make it work. It's a bit odd, but you can look past that because that's kind of understandable. But the point is that nothing specific to the GT games, nothing, none of the themes or ideas have really been translated to the movie, other than, a handful of references. And I will admit, the couple of references that were in there I did enjoy. Those were the only real moments where I sort of, sat up in my chair and was like, oh, I didn't expect that. And that was nice for a couple of them. Which I won't spoil. If you want to go see it, for me, those were the highlights of the movie, to be honest. The couple of things there. But, yeah. In terms of, well, they also use the Gran Turismo sound effects fairly regularly, like the sound effects you'd hear in the music, or not the music, in the menus. Those get used. Obviously feels kind of odd when you take it out of the game, but still, that was a nice little touch. But there's quite a few examples where things just contradict with the game. And there's one example I want to talk about in particular, which other people have mentioned, which isn't really a spoiler. So it happens relatively early in the movie, and it's to do with brake glazing. So brake glazing, for those who don't know, is where, in real life terms, is where the brakes of the car overheat to a point where it changes the material in the, I believe, the brake pads, and causes them to basically not create as much friction, so that the car doesn't stop as quickly. And effectively, that is a plot point in the movie, with the idea being that, Jann knows what that is. He can pinpoint that because, in his words, he spent, hours tuning cars in Gran Turismo, so he knows what that is. And the obvious issue is that for people who play Gran Turismo, that doesn't exist. That's not a thing in the game. It's never been part of Gran Turismo, and it just felt very, very strange. Because obviously you expect to go into there expecting, some contradictions, or not necessarily contradictions, but some inconsistencies. Some things where, the general audience is never going to notice, but that felt really egregious, because the whole point is that it's trying to put across that Gran Turismo is so realistic that, we can make these gamers into real life drivers, and they can take these ideas from the game into real life. But the example they use as like a key point, it doesn't exist in the games. It's just so odd. It's like, did no one realize this? Did no one care? Or did they know and just needed something and just couldn't think of a better example? It's just very strange. And there was also a line in the movie, I'm pretty sure it was something like, it's not a racing game, it's a racing simulator. And not gonna lie, I pretty much died when I heard that. On the inside. But yeah, I mean, what can you expect? It's a Hollywood movie. Obviously, they're going to use all the cliches they can, even if for Gran Turismo fans, it does feel painful at times. So that's my perspective as a Gran Turismo fan, but what about as just a fan of racing, or in particular racing movies? Is it worth watching if you're coming from that perspective? And my answer to that is, yeah, maybe it is. I will admit some of the racing scenes were pretty good. They were pretty exciting. And a big part of that actually was down to the sound design. I thought the sound design in this movie was really good, actually. It was really authentic with, the engine sounds and sort of the other little effects, and it all just felt weighty and impactful, and I really enjoyed that. And also a lot of the camera work, so the camera angles, the different shots they could get, they were really interesting as well. And that was also something that kept me engaged when it came to the racing. So I enjoyed that. Of course, being a racing movie, there will be crashes. I felt like the crashes were solid for the most part. There was one in particular which was very CG heavy and felt quite uncanny. But other than that, I felt like they did a decent job. So again, credit where it's due. In terms of the actual driving, seeing the cars on track. So obviously they did film a lot of real life driving, but a lot of it, in parts there were CG was used, or parts where it was edited, cars were sped up and things like that, just sort of create what they need to. And again, it's one of those things, if you watch real life motorsports, you will notice the little pieces that don't really make sense, like a driver being able to overtake another one, but they're on like a worse line, or it just seems like their car randomly speeds up or something, which again, it's an odd one. And when you're trying to put across realism from the game, translating that into real life, and then you watch the movie and then certain things don't really make sense from a racing dynamic, it's just a bit like, oh, okay, concessions need to be made, but I felt like they could have done a little bit better in that department. And also the use of the Hungaroring, the Formula One, most notably is used as a Formula One track in Budapest, which they use quite a lot without ever crediting it as the Hungaroring, because obviously they did a lot of filming there, but for the needs of the plot, it's always listed as a different track, which is fair enough if obviously they couldn't film at the tracks they needed to. But it's odd that they would use the Hungaroring as such a well-known circuit globally. For any motorsport fan could look at that and be like, oh, that's the Hungaroring, and they're trying to tell you it's a different track, and maybe they might drive it backwards and say it's another track, and it's just like, yeah, that felt a bit odd. It felt like if they were going to do that, they should have used a lesser known track or an airfield or something like that, just to make it into that. But yeah, other than that, from a racing perspective, it's pretty solid. And if you enjoy racing movies, I think you'll enjoy this one. It was decent. So, in summary, they've approached it from the perspective of what will make the best movie, rather than what represents Gran Turismo the best, which in some ways is fair enough, because it is a great story. The real life story is a great basis to build a film on, to be honest. So yeah, but knowing the real life story, knowing how it plays out with GT Academy with Jann, it feels like they could have done more with it. So some liberties have been taken in places, so obviously a couple of events being made up, as I've said, key plot points or key points in Jann's career being reordered so that it suits a better narrative in terms of character motivation and all that. I understand why they do that. Obviously, you wish it could be more authentic, but if they're trying to build up to a certain point, you can see why they've done that. But yeah, it feels like it doesn't really dig beneath the surface of the real life story that much. It doesn't sort of dig into what's already there. It just sort of adds things to what was already there. From my perspective, that's what I see. In terms of a critical response, so how it's been reviewed, honestly, it's been lukewarm at best. It's been very sort of, reviewed averagely, I'd say. And I assume that's to do with the fact that it doesn't really try a whole lot. It is very much by the numbers. It's a by-the-book sports film. Hits all the plot points it needs to. And yeah, and just ends as you'd expect it to, really. nothing more to say. But the public response that I've seen from the general audience has actually been quite positive, which is interesting. So people, just coming into it not expecting much, they've been generally enjoying the movie. So yeah, that's interesting. Remains to be seen, obviously, after its global release, if that holds, if that maintains. And it also remains to be seen what the impact of the movie is long term. So we know one of the big reasons why it exists is to get the Gran Turismo brand in front of more people. People who don't play the games, make them aware of what Gran Turismo is, which I have my doubts of it actually doing that. But obviously, I am willing to be proven wrong if it does in fact turn out to be the other way, and do exactly as it intends. But that remains to be seen. And I do potentially will cover these ideas in a video essay in the future once it's been released, and we can observe the long-term impact, and see what the general consensus is, not just among what people think about the movie, but obviously within the context of Gran Turismo as a brand. And that's what I think is interesting, and obviously potentially tying in ideas with the real life GT Academy program, and obviously what's happened since then. I think that could be interesting. So yeah, that remains to be seen. But yeah, anyway, that's about all I've got to say right now. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, obviously, if you've seen the movie. what you think. A few people have already put their thoughts on a post I made last week. But yeah, still, let me know what you think. If you're going to see them, if you're planning to see the movie, let me know what you're anticipating, what you're expecting to see, or what you're hoping to see, hoping to get from it, really. Because yeah, obviously, it's a mixed bag from my perspective. But overall, I feel like it's a decent movie. I enjoyed it. I'm happy that racing movies are being made. The more racing movies there are, generally, you know, at least generally, or racing movies of quality, because regardless of what I think about it, I still think it is a solid movie that's well put together, and I'm happy that it exists, at least. You could always wish for it to be better, but still, you know, that's my perspective. But yeah, that's about all I've got to say for now. Although for some reason, I've now got this strange urge to buy a Nissan? Huh. Weird. Anyway, have a good one.